And if there are enough comments made by the public and there's suspicion that comments have been deleted or ignored, that can be the basis for a promotion of administrative justice judicial review to court on the grounds of irrationality of a decision.
South Africa's National Department of Health has proposed new regulatory changes to the National Health Act. This will see the continuation of the more onerous COVID-19 restrictions that were first contained in the Disaster Management Act. What are the problems with this? Well, joining me to discuss is advocate Stuart Hayward. He is with the Johannesburg Bar. Stuart Hayward, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Stuart, you've written an article in the Business Day, which we'll link to below, detailing some of these proposed regulatory changes. What are some of the risks of these changes as you see them?
So, David, I think a starting point is just to briefly explain what regulations are and why regulations are important. What ordinarily happens is that ministers within the cabinet have what's called a delegated power to make regulations that comes from legislation. Now, under the Disaster Management Act, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs was given the power to regulate regarding COVID restrictions. Now, what that meant was, effectively speaking, that she was able to make regulations purely on her own discretion because the Disaster Management Act gave her that power. Now, in terms of the National Health Act, the Minister of Health is given the same discretion. Now, the problem with the proposed amendment to the regulations of the National Health Act is that the government is effectively trying to do a copy-paste job of the now repealed Disaster Management Act regulations and trying to paste them into the National Health Act regulations via an amendment. So what happened was, at the termination of the state of disaster on the 4th of April, the whole country breathed a sigh of relief because we thought this was now the end of COVID restrictions. And that was the case momentarily. The problem is the government is now trying to keep those restrictions alive in the National Health Act regulations. Now, the problem with this is what is really being proposed is that restrictions that were temporary under the Disaster Management Act, in other words, that only existed for a month and which had to be extended by virtue of the act, are now proposed to be permanent. So when a minister makes regulations, those regulations become law. And effectively speaking, we now have what were temporary extreme powers under the Disaster Management Act, which we could tolerate on the basis of the fact that perhaps they were infringements of constitutional rights, but they were temporary, so we always knew that. And now that the proposal is, as the amendment regulations are drafted, is that these regulations be permanent, which gives the Minister of Health a never-ending discretion to implement lockdowns for something as arbitrary, for example, as a malaria epidemic in Mpumalanga.
Right. So, Stuart, there's obviously this danger that you flagged of these temporary measures being made more permanent. What specific measures are you referring to there? I think in your article you referred to mandatory mask wearing indoors, for example.
So, David, I'm referring, yes, specifically to mandatory mask wearing indoors. And what I didn't refer to in the article because I didn't have space was restrictions on inbound tourism, restrictions on outdoor gatherings where outdoor gatherings are limited to 50%, still requiring a vaccination certificate. And I think, David, in terms of those limitations, the biggest problem is that it's very vague in the proposed amendment to the regulations as to for how long these restrictions will go on for. The proposed amendment merely states that during the COVID-19 epidemic, there's no indication as to who is the arbiter of when the COVID-19 epidemic and pandemic is completed. So potentially the country is stuck with these restrictions indefinitely.
Stuart, what would you recommend as an appropriate way to deal with the lingering effects of the pandemic without infringing needlessly on civil liberties?
Thank you, David. That's an excellent question. And it's something that I pointed out in my article. And it's a constructive suggestion that I've made in the article itself. And what I've proposed is that the National Health Act be amended to make provision for parliamentary oversight for regulation. Now, that is not the norm. It's highly unusual because ordinarily ministers are given the discretion by the legislation without parliamentary oversight. So what that means is, what I've proposed is that the powers of restriction be limited to, for example, 1 month, which forces the minister to come back to Parliament and justify the extension of the restrictions. I think that's an effective way to protect our constitutional rights without the scope for massive abuse that we saw, unfortunately, under the Disaster Management Act through COVID.
So, Stuart, the initial window for public comment on these legislative amendments was only for about 9 days or so, but that, after public pressure, was extended. So the new deadline, as I take it, is the 24th of April, which is just a few days away now. What would you recommend as a course of action for people who are watching this if they want to make their voices heard?
David, I'd recommend that anybody that wants to make comment do so via the Dear SA platform, dearsa.co.za, which makes it very easy to comment. All that you need to do is check some boxes. It's very, very simple. And I just want to, if I may, David, just state the importance of making comment. A lot of people think it's a pointless exercise and and the minister would just ignore it. But this is not the case. The minister is obliged to take comments into consideration in potentially amending the regulations or repealing the regulations. And if there are enough comments made by the public and if there's suspicion that comments have been deleted or ignored, that can be the basis for a promotion of administrative justice judicial review to court on the grounds of irrationality of a decision. So the public can help the NGOs that will inevitably, I think, take this matter to the Constitutional Court if government does not step back and make the necessary amendments. So the public can help those NGOs by making comment. A comment is extremely important, and I urge everybody to do so. You can find the link to the Dear SA platform for voting and for commenting in my article in Business Day.
Stuart Hayward, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. Do you think that the proposed changes to the National Health Act regulations are a threat to civil liberties in South Africa? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to check out this video over here. And also, please remember to subscribe to the channel. You can do so by clicking here. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.